The moment you give a tool calling capable LLM a tool, call it web search, call it write code and execute code, call it look at my files. And here's the important part. The LLM has the decision-making power to either call, or more importantly, not call that tool. That's an agent. The second the LLM has the capacity to decide whether to use or not use a tool, that LLM has become an agent. Now, has the whole system become an agent? No. Usually you call that an agentic workflow because some components are pre-designed, but sometimes it leads to an LLM with tools.
Welcome to ODSC's AIX podcast, your gateway to the latest in everything AI. Whether you're a seasoned AI expert or exploring how to bring AI into your work or career, we bring you insights from the best minds in the field. We host researchers, practitioners, and industry leaders shaping the future of AI and how it's being applied across research, product, and industry. This episode is sponsored by ODSC AI East, the premier AI Builders Conference, coming up this April 28th to 30th, 2026 in Boston and virtually. Learn more at odsc.ai/east and use the code podcast for an exclusive 10% discount. We're also bringing back the Agentic AI Summit, a virtual 3-week conference this January 21st to February 5th. Learn more at summit.ai.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the ODSC AIX podcast. Now, today's episode is titled AI Agents versus Workflows, and we want to look at the reality of what actually works for agentic workflows. And we've got a real treat for you because today's guest is none other than Sinan Ozdemir, who, as you may well know, is an AI author, entrepreneur, and consultant with over a decade in experience helping companies build real-world AI systems. And now Sinan just released his latest book, Building Agentic AI Workflows, which I've read myself, and it really does a good job of cutting through the noise around AI by showing engineers and leaders alike when agents truly make sense, when simpler workflows suffice, and how fine-tuning can evaluate these systems from proof of concept to dependable production tools. Now, in this conversation, we're going to talk about the gap between agent hype and practical reality, how to think about tool design, calibration, and confidence. Also, why fine-tuning isn't just optimal, it can be a game changer when you want AI systems that actually work for your domain. So whether you're building your first agentic workflow or evaluating where AI fits into your organization, this episode is packed with insights you do not want to miss. Sinan, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Seamus.
Well, we chatted not too long ago at the end of October at ODSC West. You gave a talk there about benchmarking AI.
On Halloween, and just like that, I'm also wearing a different costume, but it's a different holiday.
Those are listeners not watching this. Sinan's looking very festive. He has a nice little Santa hat there since we recorded this just before Christmas. So I think that he's about to deliver the gift of knowledge around his new book, which is on agentic AI workflows, etc. So Sinan, what have you been up to since I've seen you last?
Honestly, 1.5 months since I've seen you. It's been mostly working on marketing for the new book, working on a few new talks, a few new lectures, mostly centered around building frameworks for companies around adopting AI, not necessarily agents, just AI in general for their employees, figuring out the right way to make it stick. More likely in a lot of people's cases, how to actually introduce AI to their employees for the first time. So it's been a mix of working with companies on AI and working on my case studies for my future books, because there's always a future book in the works, Seamus.
Yeah, I've been working on a little book project myself, and I've learned the hard way that it should be an ongoing project.
Oh, yeah. I think I've said this on this show. Almost every case study in any book I've written is in some way inspired by either a former client or something I saw on LinkedIn or Twitter and said, oh, it's interesting. I wonder if I can turn this into a larger case study around that topic. So anything you read in my books, very likely it came from an actual project I worked on or something someone else did that I wanted to make a bigger case study out of.
Excellent. Then, Sinan, if you want to just tell people a little bit about your background.
Sure, yeah, of course. My name is Sinan Ozdemir. I am a AI author, entrepreneur, and lecturer. I've been working in generative AI for over 10 years. Yes, you heard me right. Generative AI existed 10 plus years ago. These days, I mostly consult for both private and public companies on building AI frameworks and building production-ready AI systems for them. or advising them to build them. And I also write books, for which the most recent one is Building Agentic AI, part of the Pearson AI Signature Series with John Cron. That's why we're here today.
Yes, fantastic. And I have read that book, really some excellent insights there. And I know we've had a lot of agentic AI and AI agents discussion on this podcast, but I think our listeners are going to learn something new today. But look, at the time of recording, this is, the week before the holidays. And 2025 was supposed to be the year of AI agents, the year of agentic AI. So before we get into the book, has 2026 lived up to the hype in the AI world?
2025, has it lived up to the hype? No. It's lived up to the hype in the sense of it's been hyped all year, but it hasn't lived up to that hype in the sense of there has not been a proliferation of AI agents taking over human labor or expanding on human labor. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think to really think about the year of agents, if I'm being perfectly honest, as a teacher, I look at that phrase, this is the year of the agent. And I think a lot of business folk will look at that phrase and say, great, it's time to implement agents. And I look at that phrase and say, no, it's time to teach everyone about agents, because you can't necessarily do both of those things in 1 year and notice huge differences. A lot of the point of the book is to say, the goal of the book is not to get you to implement an agent by the end. That's not the point of the book. If that's what you want to do, the book will help you do that. The point of the book is to elucidate a lot of the concepts around agentic AI. Some are old, some are new, and some are a combination of what we've been doing for decades with modern deep learning architectures. If anything, 2026, maybe even 2027, is where I genuinely mean, hopefully, most people who want to implement agents will have the knowledge skill set to do so if it makes sense for their workspace. The big theme of the book is, do agents even make sense for what you're trying to build? Or could you get away with a simple workflow rather than relying on some agentic system?
Yeah, that's very much on point. There is a big gap between what people were hoping to achieve with agentic AI versus what was actually delivered in 2025. Yeah, looking back in the year from my perspective, I think it was interesting. Anthropic released their reasoning model in November of last year, and that set the wave of reasoning models. I think a lot of these reasoning models really powered the agentic workflows. We also saw significant releases of open source reasoning models, like the OSS models from OpenAI. That's a big deal. And then, of course, the DeepSeek models, Alibaba, Quen models getting better.
I was about to say, if I may, I personally would not put GPT OSS even on the top 5 of the best open source models on the planet.
Really?
100%. I would say Quen is definitely up there. Kimi models, for me, are some of the best open source models, period. There's also GLM.
Are you basing that in the benchmarks? Because I've been using OSS locally. I've been using DeepSeek R3. I've been using some of the Quen models. And again, my use cases are pretty simple, so it's hard to distinguish them.
Sure.
Is that from client feedback, generally speaking, or?
It's client feedback, and also, I don't even know the benchmark. I don't look at benchmark scores anymore, quite frankly, and we can get into that if you want. But if a model comes out and there's press about it, I'm going to go ahead and assume it scored well on at least some benchmarks that some people care about. I am basing this off of actual case studies, empirical studies. Like when I use Kimi versus OSS, I can see the difference. Now, to be fair, OSS caps out at 20 billion, which is huge. It's a large model, but the Kimi models are very much on par with those frontier closed source models at those similar sizes. So when I talk about GLM or Quen especially is one of my favorite, mostly because they go as small as 500 million.
That's right.
Quen 3, 500 million, for me, in a lot of cases, works as well as 20 billion parameters from OpenAI's open source model. So when you kind of think of it that way, and again, not necessarily on all tasks, on all benchmarks, but depending on your task, I've seen people get away with 3 or fewer billion parameters and still work as well as if you had thrown it to Anthropic's Opus or even OSS 120.
Yeah, and that's very important for listeners because when you're using these open weight models, very good for privacy, very good for building out your own agentic workflows and having that brain and not dealing with that token cost explosion. But we'll come back to that topic because just before we came on air, congratulations, you did the book launch. But I was asking you, what's one of the most common questions you're getting around this book?
Yeah, basically the number one questions I always get are, how do I build an agent? Great question, because you have your choice of the litter, if you will. You've got low no-code solutions like N8N or DataStax, which was purchased by IBM. So you have your low no code solutions for agent building. OpenAI has one, not so great from what I've read. I've never tried it personally, but I've heard it wasn't the best release. And there's several other kind of agent workflow builders out there that do not require any coding. Most of my audience tends to be around the developer, or at the very least, developer curious. They're willing to write code to do something the right way. I often come back to LangChain and LangGraph specifically. I would say the number one reason I almost always recommend LangGraph, even when I'm giving private workshops to Fortune 100 companies, is you're never going to get more flexibility than you are with LangGraph. Meaning, if you want to build an agent, they got you covered. If you want to build a multi-agent system, they got you covered. Now, caveat, it's a little bit tricky to build a multi-agent system on LangGraph right now, but they're working on it. Quite frankly, I know for a fact they're working on it, but it's still possible. If you want to build no agent and just build a simple workflow of LLMs and prompts chained together, you can do that in Lang. It's basically your one-stop developer shop for anything you want to do with AI and LLMs, agents included. So for that reason, it is almost always the top of the list for what framework should I learn to get started with agents or just LLMs in general.
LangFlow also has been a very popular.
Another low no code solution with LangGraph under the hood. It's like they're kind of all the same. It just comes down to who's going to charge you the least.
Exactly. You mentioned LangGraph in your book, which has been very popular at the ODSC conference as well.
It's almost exclusively LangGraph. I think I mentioned other frameworks, but you can use Crew. Anything you can do in Crew, you can do in LangGraph. Anything you can do in LangGraph, you can't necessarily do in Crew. It is basically anything you want to do, LangGraph can do it.
So let's get into some of the nitty-gritty details here, because a lot of people get confused around workflow versus agents, right? What's a workflow? What's an agent? How do you measure them? Can you talk a little bit about workflow versus agents?
Yeah, the very simple definitional difference between the two is a workflow is pre-designed. There are pre-designed data and code pathways that might include LLMs, to be very clear. I write a prompt, the prompt outputs a yes, no, a 1 of 10, what have you. But if you're pre-designing a data pathway that happens to flow through LLMs or not, that's a workflow. The line in the sand for when you are working with an agent is the idea of function calling or tool calling. Classic example is deep research. If you go on OpenAI's deep research right now, I love deep research, to be very, very clear. This is not going to be a bad mouth of OpenAI's deep research. But if you ask it to do something for you, and you are very clear in saying, do not ask me any follow-up questions, just go, 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 please do this work for me, it will, as a recording, still ask you at least one question to clarify before moving on. That, to me, is a signal that they have built an agentic workflow, meaning there is a pre-designed ask a question step that they are not allowed to skip in moving forward in that workflow. Once you get past that speed bump, then the LLMs have tools. Oh, let me web search this. Oh, I saw this. Let me web search that. I found this. Now I'm done the answer. That combination of deterministic pre-designed code path of ask a question with LLMs with tools, the agent, makes it an agentic workflow.
Got it. Yeah, and I 100% agree. I was using Claude Anthropic, the Chrome extension, as an agent browser for one simple task, just to basically research 20 lines in a spreadsheet and ask me 7 different times, is it okay to proceed with the plan?
That might be part of its prompt, for example. You could put in its prompt, ask clarifying questions.
Yeah, I did the opposite. I said, don't ask any more clarifying questions. And I continued to ask them, just as you said, part of its training.
Probably some kind of agentic workflow.
Going back to 2025, hype versus reality, we all saw that report saying that 95% of Gen AI projects don't return an ROI. I've been over that report many times. And one thing is pretty obvious to me, that money was spent in AI, of course, and then the ROI didn't match the money spent. So that's kind of shifted the conversation a little bit in a positive way. And I also like in your book, because talking about benchmarks, because you benchmark agents against workflows in terms of accuracy, latency, and cost, right? And you're also saying agents are always necessary. I thought that was pretty refreshing to see that.
It's a pretty common takeaway that when you pin a workflow versus an agent deployment, again, not agentic workflow, a pure workflow versus an agent doing that same task, usually what ends up happening is they perform similarly. Often the agent performs slightly better than the workflow, but you almost always will see a higher cost and a higher latency, just a worse time to actually solve the tasks for you. Now, Is that always the case? No. Can you prompt it better so that it is using fewer tokens and using a lot less time? And you could get there where an agent performs as well as a workflow. But again, coming back to this idea that 2025 is the year of the agent, a lot of people took that to mean, oh, great. LLMs are finally powerful enough that they can just replace my entire workflows without having to do anything. They realized that was not the case and did not want to put the work in to actually make the agent work better. They fail into the category of 95% of projects don't return ROI. I'm not saying that's everybody. The report is actually quite clear about how to break that all down. But that is a pretty big portion of those people and people that I actually work with who say, oh, I thought the LLMs were powerful enough. That's where the confusion comes in. Whereas no, the agent means this is a technology to watch and learn about and get up to speed on. Not necessarily it's ready to take over all of our jobs.
A chasm between perception and reality there. As you just mentioned, the LLMs are not good enough because you did make a sharp point in the book that these agents often fail, not because they reason badly, but because the tools themselves are badly described, are too loosely scoped. Our listeners have already listened to the podcast we recorded with Sterling Chin a few weeks ago around, I think it was API for agents. He made a similar point that APIs were basically written for humans. So for example, you have an API from a service provider that says get data. There's no context, no examples for few shots examples. And so what I've started to think about after that conversation with Sterling is if we're building these agentic workflows, how should we think about tool design as more of a first-class interface, not just a back-end plugin? And because too many agentic workflows are just treating them as like a back-end plugin. And I've been searching and I could not find them, but there's been very few design principles around AI agent-ready tools.
I agree. I'll be the first to admit my book is not going to pretend to provide the framework for writing tool descriptions. But to your point, a lot of our case studies in the book boiled down to the agent's not calling the right tool. I thought it was going to use this tool. It seems the most obvious tool to me, but why did it not seem like the obvious tool to the agent?
Yeah, if you just explain to our audience, like some of them may not be understanding that because that's a super key point. You give a list of 5 tools or 10 tools, you give the description, I'm supposed to do it, or I can even skip using the tool if you can just describe that.
That I was going to say. So there's a few issues here. Name out 2 or 3 big ones. One is the concept of you give an LLM a tool, meaning you say, there's this function, call it a Python function. There's this Python function here. It's called web search. Under it, it says, use this tool when you want to look something up on the internet. Usually that's where the tool description stops. Then there's a function signature, meaning these are the inputs. It requires a string. This is the thing you are Googling effectively. And then results come back as a list. And again, the concept of this is a function that you're allowed to call makes sense. Now, here's one of the big reasons why that's not going to work all the time. When you phrase a tool, use this tool when you want to look something up. When should I look something up? Because when the second you humanize, personalize the AI language, doesn't really, as far as at the time of recording, the AI wants nothing. It doesn't want to do any of this. So when you say when you want to look something up, it's kind of a weird phrasing. You really should be phrasing tools like use this tool when a user is asking questions that require citations, lookups, or knowledge of current events. The concept of does an AI know what it doesn't know? Which leads me to the main case study that talks about that in the book, where I give an AI the ability to look up customer support documents. And I say, you're a customer support bot. You have one tool, literally one tool called look something up in the customer support database. Seems obvious to me when you get a question, you should use that tool to look up a policy. What I found was GPT or several other LLMs, frontier models would take that direction and say, I'm not going to look this up 95% of the time. I'm so confident that I know the answer. I don't need to look this up. And you never told me I have to. You just said, I get to look this up. And I'm deciding no. So when I give it the tool versus not giving it the tool, it actually performs roughly the same because it doesn't look it up. When it chooses not to use the tool, at that point, you've basically made it just an LLM who's now actively making the decision to just be an LLM. So you've made it harder and you're still not getting any efficacy of the tool. Here's the kicker though. In that same case study, when I told frontier models, you have to use this tool every single time, On average, they only use the tool 90 to 95% of the time. That's a lot, but it's not 100%. So even frontier models fail at following my very clear instruction of always look something up before you answer anyone's customer support question. So simply leading an agent to a tool does not mean they will drink the tool, unfortunately.
Yeah, now actually, you mentioned calibration. That was one of my favorite parts of the book, that focus on calibration, not just accuracy, because a lot of people were talking about agentic AI. It's non-deterministic. How do we get this actually? If I paraphrase this correctly, you were saying that the agentic system doesn't just need to get the answer right. They need to know when they're wrong, because that often determines whether you need to escalate a bad decision in one of these workflows, right?
When they're wrong, when they don't know the answer.
Yeah.
I'll ask this to the audience. When was the last time you heard an AI say, I don't know? Think about it. It's probably never for most of you. I have seen it. I have seen an LM say, I don't know. So I'm not saying never.
Yeah,
But for
definitely
most
over
of
models.
you've probably said, oh, I've never heard an AI say that. And yet we blame them for hallucinating facts. And yet
Yeah.
the answer doesn't say, well, why don't we just teach them to know what they don't know? That's a hard thing to do.
Well, hallucination still matters, but I think what you're hitting the nail on the head there. This is really an overconfidence problem. Overconfidence is closely related to hallucination, but not only.
It's overconfident. It's also just more of a mechanical issue. The AI
Yeah.
has to say something, right? They're trained to answer questions. When
Yeah.
it receives a question, it thinks, I have to answer. This is all I know.
But even overconfidence, tool calling, right? Because I've seen it happen so many times. Why did it call this tool? And it just thought it was the right answer. Like, it's overconfidence. Like, it wasn't hallucinating. Conversely, the LLM is overconfident that it doesn't need a tool. It's going back to a fallback.
It's the calibration. It's, I don't need this tool. I know the answer. He goes, no, you don't. I can tell you don't.
Yeah, that was definitely interesting. And I did also like your section around MCP, because I'm a fan of MCP, and I like what Anthropic has done around that. And I like what Anthropic has done this year in general. They came out with Cloud Skills with Cloud Cowork. I'm still kind of playing around with. MCP was a good initiative that came out in November 2024. It caught fire in March or April of 2025. But I like the idea if you have tools, then you need skills to use those tools. But again, what I like about what you write, Sinan, I can tell that you're in the weeds working with companies and building this, because MCP has a lot of issues, thousands of MCP servers out there, and the majority are not even written by the companies who own the APIs. Most commonly, they are self-hosted, but sometimes remotely hosted. I think you mentioned it was a double-edged sword, because these tools are not well described. And you mentioned that the agents can fail because they're just reading the wrong descriptions or the docustring or whatever.
Yeah, it's Danish for, to be quite honest, at the time of recording, Anthropic has done so much work with us. I'm a big fan of MCP, to be very clear. They actually just donated it to the Linux Foundation. It's growing in popularity, and for a good reason.
Yeah.
Humans crave standardization, and MCP was built for humans, because an LLM does not care if your tool came from an MCP server or not. It is irrelevant. It is still simply receiving a name, a description, a function signature, and that's about it. Whether it came from an MCP server or not, it doesn't care. The MCP was built for us, which is great. An AI does not get better because you're using MCP. MCP is just a standardized format so that it makes it easier to share. Now, that leads to the other edge of that sword, to your point, Seamus, which is one of the examples as I build an SDR, a multi-agent SDR. And for one of those SDRs, I needed access to HubSpot. I needed to give the agent access to HubSpot. So I said, does HubSpot have an MCP? No. Fine. Someone must have made one. So you start Googling around Smithery and GitHub, frankly, of who's made HubSpot MCPs. Thousands of people. Cool. The ones I could find that actually ran and worked had hundreds of tools. They had a tool for every CRUD operation imaginable. One to create contact, one to delete contact, one to update contact. And then you end up with this MCP with literally 100 plus tools. And I go, LM's not going to be able to handle this. They need to consolidate the tools. There should be one tool called work with contacts. And that one tool should have a parameter that says update, create, delete. What should I do in the contact namespace? So you're consolidating the tool choice, and you're forcing the AI to say, well, I chose the tool around the namespace that I need to work in. I just now need to fill out the parameters to do the exact thing I want to do. So the AI is happier because it has fewer tools to pick from, and you're still getting the exact same amount of work possible. I made my own in the book. I literally was like, I just made my own HubSpot MCP and called it a day, because these are the tools I need. I don't need all these other API endpoints. This is just what I'm going to use.
Yeah, no, exactly. And by the way, for our listeners, SDR, sales development representative.
Sorry, yeah, it was a sales rep. It was doing lead
Sales rep.
generation for me and putting in HubSpot.
Yeah, no, HubSpot. Got you. And I was very keen around that case study. I think I pinged you when I was reading the book, and you GitHub repo for the book wasn't pushed yet. I'm like, because come on, what companies have FBR integration to Salesforce or HubSpot?
Yeah, you texted me quick. I was like, where's the GitHub for the SDR? I'm like, literally 2 days away, Seamus. I'm so sorry. The GitHub is up.
I was already on chapter 6. You know, I had a use case for that. And it was nice as well because we actually have HubSpot at a couple of companies I work with.
I love the HubSpot API. It's so easy.
Yeah, I've been vibe coding against that thing. The sales team doesn't like it so much because now I can tell what's going on. But yeah, so that's a great repository. I'll probably link to that in the show notes.
Put the GitHub, the Amazon. The code for all of my books is free forever on GitHub. If you are someone who just wants to go through the coding notebooks, they're all in the GitHub. The GitHub will link to the Amazon if you want the actual book, but the code for all my books is free forever and always.
Yeah. And so going back to what you're saying about tools, because towards the end of the book, you got into fine tuning as well, which seems to me like a bit of an ebb and a flow topic. People were so hot on fine tuning and then it ebbed anyway. We have the agent, we have the memory, we have the tools. And I do like that domain adoption case study you did because you framed fine tuning as an alternative to tool-based lookup. I found myself going, wait, I'm guilty of that. There's an API out there, there's a tool. I guess the question there is, when should a team fine-tune knowledge into the model versus keeping it external with a retrieval tool?
Yeah, I mean, fine-tuning it, to your point, you know, even on my own podcast, I had the pleasure of interviewing one of the lead engineers of SageMaker, one of the first kind of fine-tuning platforms on AWS. And there's always been this fascination of, well, how do I actually, to be clear, when we get a new GPT model or a new update to a model like 5.1, 5.2, or whatever decimal they're on these days, fine-tuning is happening. The foundation labs are performing fine-tuning to update the model to have more information. My thesis is we know what they're doing. The techniques of fine-tuning are very much non-proprietary. Any fine-tuning company out there, including my own, I happen to be the founder of a company who helps people fine-tune models. No one is doing proprietary fine-tuning. We're all sharing the same base of knowledge. What happens, though, is knowing what to fine-tune, when, and how. Book has actually 2 main fine-tuning examples. One is the one that you mentioned, which is I take an 8 billion parameter model, and instead of giving it a tool to look up policy information, and by the way, this works best when your tools are for retrieve. Agentic RAG is a great use case for this. If you are looking stuff up just to give the agent context, fine-tuning is an excellent option to try. Instead of looking things up, I say, I'm going to directly shove these policy documents into your parameters. The term of art is called continued pre-training. I'm basically tricking the LLM into thinking it's read these policy documents at the same time it read Common Crawl, these other huge corpora of pre-training data, so that it's still a chatbot. It can still call tools. It just happens to now have internalized information from those policy documents. And an 8 billion parameter model performs then the nano and mini versions of GPT with tools. And it's only 15 percentage points worse, like 75 versus 90%, as good as normal GPT-4 with the ability to look stuff up, and you have to tell it. So if I can get an 8 billion parameter model to perform nearly as well as a foundation AI with the ability to look things up in real time, that's promising. Now, what if 8 became 20? What if 20 became 120? What if I took GPT OSS 120, which I think is not the best model off the shelf, but fine-tuned it with my company's domain information? Now we're talking. That is now a very powerful model with my company's information in it. And I now no longer have to rely on a foundation AI and give it the ability to look things up.
Yeah, exactly. Because when I read that chapter, it made me think about the hidden cost of doing this. So let's say if you took that information, put it into a RAG system, embedded it, especially if it's not real time, there's a cost for doing that. And even when I looked at some of my examples, okay, when I'm doing a web search, I'm generally for historical data, not like, hey, what's the latest news on robotics and AI right now? So I think that was a point very well made, because it made me wonder if it will make for a more robust agentic system, because generally when we're working with agentic systems, we're dealing a lot with agent mistakes. Does fine-tuning reduce those agent mistakes, like looking up the wrong tools?
Yes.
Instead of tools, that's one mistake.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole bunch of companies and open source frameworks that help with the fine tuning of agents very specifically so that they are better at tool calling. They know which tool to call first.
And you know me, name names. Is Unsloth one of them?
Unsloth is one of them. Yes. Actually, I use Unsloth in the book. Big fan. Hey, Unsloth, founders, if there are people, if you're listening to me, let's chat because I love what you're doing. Basically, two mathematicians, but probably more now, took TRL, which is the Transformers fine-tuning library from Hugging Face, and they rewrote a bunch of the low-level math, the kernels, if you will, for those who know what that is. They basically rewrote a bunch of the code to make it way more efficient, to do the exact same fine-tuning, just with less compute and faster. Unsloth, since then, has really grown into a pretty big community. And I use Unsloth to do that fine-tuning example that I just told you about with the Quen model. There's no dearth of open source frameworks out there that will help you do this. I just have one example in my book.
Yeah, and I think I've done fine-tuning maybe a dozen times.
Sure.
And I would say 5 times out of 6 was a definite failure.
Sure.
I did read that section in your book because you did advise to fine-tune slowly. And you talked about the issue of catastrophic forgetting. So give listeners and me some advice. I was fine-tuning a lot in 2024, a little bit more this year. I need to get back to it. I haven't used Onslaught, even though it's been on my
Should.
to do.
It's got to be a cute animal name, though, like sloth or axolotl. If it's not a very cute animal name, it's probably not good. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
But
There's axolotl. I think Llama Factory is another one I want to try.
I've never used Llama Factory. I don't know how good that is.
But back to my
With
question.
Onslaught.
So walk me through it. Let's assume I'm doing this for the first time or I have done it.
Sure.
With questionable success, what's best practices for fine-tuning?
Two big things. One is if you are fine-tuning a chatbot with the concept of a back and forth conversation, it's harder than you think. Not trying to discourage you, but it can be as simple as shove a bunch of good conversations in the past and hope it picks up on that. So my main advice is what you often see being provided as a service, AI has fine-tuning. Fireworks has fine-tuning as a service. Both use efficient, low-rank adaptation techniques to help you make it cheaper and faster. That's great. But they're only really providing one type of fine-tuning called supervised fine-tuning, where you give it examples of things that are good and you ask the LLM to internalize those good examples and try to be more like them. But now you have to make sure that your training data covers as many instances as possible so the AI sees all these different use cases and can learn as much as it can. The data gathering and labeling alone, which is part of what my company even helps companies do, is tricky. I mentioned one called continued pre-training. That's not supervised fine-tuning. I did not give Quen examples of conversations in which it was expected to answer questions. I basically just said, read these policy documents and try not to forget anything else. I'm just imbuing it with the knowledge instead of forcing it to follow a conversational structure. I didn't even touch reinforcement learning in the book. That's going to be in the second edition, which I'm already working on. There's another class of fine-tuning called reinforcement learning, where the agent is basically expected to try and fail and learn from its own failures and successes. So there's a wide world of recipes out there. And again, I don't say this to discourage anyone from fine-tuning. If anything, I'm saying this to encourage them to learn about all of those different recipes, continued pre-training, supervised fine-tuning, reinforcement fine-tuning, DPO, PPO, GRPO. These are all real algorithms. And if you want to go down that rabbit hole with me or someone else, happy to. Second thing to remember is not only is there a wide world of recipes, there's a wide world of applications and models. I'll give you one example. If you are going to fine-tune a RAG system, you can do what I did, which is give Quen all these policy documents. You could also fix your retrieval to make your retrieval better, because most people will just simply use OpenAI embedders off the shelf because they don't know any other embedders. First of all, there's hundreds of usable embedder models out there, both open and closed source. Last chapter of the book, I fine-tune a Matryoshka embedder that can produce, which basically means the embedder can output multiple sized embedding outputs like OpenAI's does, to be very fair, where the 64 dimension output was nearly as good as a 1024 dimension output on my custom domain data. You can also fine-tune the embedder and not even touch the LLM and you'll still get better results. Ideally, you do both. It becomes this fun puzzle of what do I fine tune and how do I string these things together to beat billions of dollars being spent by OpenAI. I only need to spend thousands of dollars to beat them.
No, I can see a gulf between what people are generally doing with pilots, agentic workflows versus what you're advocating for, because that can make such a huge difference between fine-tuning the embeddings, fine-tuning the memory. Because I noticed that ODSC West night, for the talks we did have around agentic workflows, I did see a few sessions there and workshops where teams are fine-tuning models specifically for the agent role. It could be a planner, tool routing was a big topic, even LLM model routing, or as a critic, as a judge, or even now fine-tuning them for being an executor on different data sets and objectives per their role, right? So the whole idea is, instead of one big agent, you're going to build a multi-agent system. What data sets are you giving them? What are you tuning them on? And policies and objectives. I saw some cool examples there, especially in finance, healthcare, legal, because everyone was talking about how do we build trust, and we barely have trust in LLMs themselves. How do we get trust in these agents in high stakes environments? That, I think the key term there was that domain aware behavior. It was kind of big. Any advice out there for people trying to build domain specific agentic workflows?
Yeah, obviously fine tuning is on the table, but that is, in a lot of ways, it's kind of your last resort. I would encourage people to try non fine tuning techniques first because they're easier, cheaper, and faster to iterate on. Which kind of sounds weird because I've been really hyping fine tuning for a while now, but it's still your last best shot at building a private domain aware LLM in which you do not have to share your domain examples to a foundation lab. Fine tuning is the answer. But if you're not ready to take that step, usually what I recommend building and iterating on an eval pipeline, which sounds easier said than done. What might sound obvious to you probably does not sound obvious to the AI. So if you are going to figure out, well, what context is this thing missing? First thing you're going to have to decide is what's in the prompt and what is obtained via a tool call. For example, if I'm building a medical device reviewer where it's reviewing applications for medical devices, some information is going to be static across all of my reviews. For example, a medical device is going to be approved if XYZ, if it's in this category, blah, 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 put it here. That's static information. That should not be retrieved via a tool call. And a lot of people will say, well, it should be. I go, well, there's the caveat. If you put it in the prompt directly, yes, your context window gets bigger, but caching type systems, depending on the models that you're using, caching will help you reduce the cost and speed. If you put it in a tool, you break that cache because the tool call will always have a unique ID that's going to fail in the cache hit. And second, now you have to wait for the AI to hopefully decide to go get the context when you could have just given it in the first place. Figuring out what's dynamic and what's static is going to be one of the first things. And then the second piece of big advice I would give is don't be afraid to switch models. Some models will perform better in certain domains, not necessarily because the foundation labs tried to do that, but it just happens to be statistically coincidentally this model happens to be better at medical devices, which is why I said the evals are very important. Setting up a golden set of evals and just try, and I'm not kidding, 30 or 40 different LLMs. If you're trying Anthropic, don't just try Opus 4.5. Try Haiku 3.5. If you think it's going to perform worse, prove it. And it's not going to spend much money. It's all the same tool calling LLMs frameworks. All you're doing is swapping out a model identifier. And if you're using something like OpenRouter, which is a model aggregator, it's easy to switch between Anthropic and OpenAI and change nothing else, especially if you're using language. So do not be afraid. Like when I go into my clients, within a week or two, I'll hand them a report and say, I tried these 50 LLMs. And they'll usually look at me and say, I didn't realize there were 50 LLMs. And I go, of course there are.
Are you a fan of the models you see in Hugging Face? So a new model comes out and there'll be hundreds of fine-tuned trained models around the new models in different tasks. Do you ever go up on Hugging Face and say, okay, well, maybe someone created a version of this fine-tuned to X, Y, or Z?
Every day. I am on Hugging Face. I'm not necessarily looking for all the fine-tuned models, but if there is a new trending model or a model I know is not new, but is trending, I will almost always click on it to see, well, is it because people are fine tuning it, quantizing it? Is it actually a brand new model? Are people finding a new use case for it. So I'm not specifically looking for fine-tuned versions of models, but it does come up in my research every day.
Yeah, and just to make this real for people, the cost of fine tuning is coming down dramatically.
Oh,
An executive comes over to you and says, look, we've got, I don't know, say a couple 100,000 or even a couple of million documents. What are you kind of telling them ballpark figures that's going to cost for generic models?
Generic, yeah, low 5 figures. So you should be ready to drop at least $8,000 to $10,000. If you're talking millions of documents, you're going to be ready to drop $10,000 at least.
Right.
Is that a lot? Yes. Is that a lot for a company who has this data already? Not really.
Yeah.
In one classification example in the book, what cost me $1 on a Colab notebook to beat the performance of a fine-tuned model on OpenAI cost me $120 to fine-tune it on OpenAI. So $1 versus $120 to get basically the same performance.
Well, yeah, let's say someone's working on agentic workflow. They want to try some fine tuning. What can they start with reasonably before the boss starts yelling? With me, as soon as the bills start getting up into a couple of thousand, someone's yelling at me. But what's a couple $100 I can try at work with a sandbox budget?
Go to Unsloth. I'm not kidding. Go to Unsloth. There have a repository of example notebooks, which will range from things like GRPO with DeepSeek style reinforcement learning to things like classification. Find different open source frameworks that do fine tuning. Transformers or TRL from Hugging Face is one. Unsloth, Axolot, they are doing the work for you, quite frankly. They're showing you, run this on Colab, it's only going to cost you like $10. They'll say, well, we're limiting it to only 50 documents out of these million documents. You are free to increase that limit and spend more money. This is just the framework for doing the fine tuning.
Great. That's a really good way to ease into it. Make sure you're going to deliver some value before you blow the monthly budget on fine tuning and then come back to me and say, Seamus, it's still not working. There are a few things that I see coming in, but people are starting to really talk about it because the price is coming down, about this continual fine tuning, right? Dynamic versus static. And really kind of replace RAG with continual fine tuning where they're updating it, they're running it, they're updating more models. Have you started seeing that in practice or is this just hype?
To be very biased, that is what my company does. My company is very much focused on helping people turn their workflows into an online learning, continual learning agent, basically a fine-tuned model. So yes, I see that in practice, and I see it in practice so much, I wanted to build a company out of it because many of my clients, even if they don't decide to go that route, know it's an option experiment on the table and want to try it and do not have the ML resources to do it themselves. Hence, I make the company that does it for them so that they don't have to hire a $300,000 a year ML engineer to do it for them.
All right, Sinan, I got to say, this has been a masterclass in fine tuning for agents. I need to get the name of that company, your new startup. I'll put that on the show notes if you want me to.
Yeah, of course. It's called Crucible.
Crucible. Great name. And where can people learn more about your book? Do you have your own personal website?
I have my own personal website. We'll put a link to the GitHub in the show notes. And then from there, if you want to buy the book, I'll appreciate it. But hey, if you don't want to, that's totally fine. I post mostly on LinkedIn, not really on Twitter. If someone wants to help me post more on Twitter, I'm happy to talk to them. Mostly my website, LinkedIn, or my GitHub, where I'm the most active.
Well, thank you so much, Sinan. Super appreciate it. Great book. Congratulations on the launch. I know it's going to be a bestseller, and I hope our listeners will grab a copy. All right. Thank you, Sinan.
Right.
This episode is sponsored by ODSC AI East, the premier AI Builders Conference coming up this April 20th to 30th, 2026 in Boston and virtually. Learn more at odsc.ai/east, and don't forget to use the code PODCAST for an exclusive 10% discount. Supporting our podcast by subscribing not only helps our small dedicated team at ODSC AI, also unlocks exclusive benefits for you. Your engagement directly contributes to the growth and success of our community. Please subscribe now and don't miss out on the next enlightening episode.